Our speaker tonight is someone who has thought long and hard about these kind of questions. And thought long and hard about these kind of questions in the context of a deep and profound engagement with Christian, theological, and moral reflection. Dr. Jonathan Chaplin is our speaker tonight. We were thinking today, we're trying to remember when we first met and when we last saw each other. It has been embarrassingly a long time. Embarrassing for me because when I think about, I'm not quite so young as I sometimes imagine myself to be. But he's a fellow at Wesley Hall in Cambridge. He has held a number of positions, both here in North America and back there in the UK. He is the author of several books, some of which I've taught in my classes, much to my students' profit, I think. And tonight he is going to talk about democracy and diversity. So please welcome Dr. Jonathan Chaplin.
Thank you very much indeed for that kind welcome, and thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. Thanks to Politics and International Relations and the Centre for Applied Christian Studies. Very practical, thank you very much, that's really helpful. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honour to address you this evening. And thank you for coming out. I know for many of you students it's a time of deadlines, so if you came even though you've got a deadline imminent, extra brownie points for you. It's a pretty grim autumn evening, so thanks for everybody else who managed to make it out here tonight. So diversity is a very broad topic. There is a great diversity of diversities. People have to find ways to live with all kinds of diversity in every department of life, on a daily basis. Families, neighbourhoods, schools, colleges, businesses, charities, all have to work out how to manage all sorts of diversity among their members, their employees, their clients. Deep diversities or shallow diversities, conflictual diversities or congenial diversities. And would you believe it, churches have to do the same thing. But many people today report that dealing with diversities in many of these settings is just getting a lot harder, for a host of reasons. The diverse identities and the claims arising from those identities that people assert seem to be growing in number and in intensity, often touching our sense of personal worth and social standing more deeply than they used to. Diversity is getting tougher, and it's causing deeper and sometimes toxic disagreement. So, not surprisingly, you find today in the USA and in my country and much of Europe, many commentators lamenting a general decline of respect, trust, patience, just the willingness to listen, all of which speaks of a decline in our ability to live with diversity. And these commentators are urging us to renew our social bonds and our civic virtues, our personal virtues, to enable us to be more at ease with diversity than we currently are. Well, I'm sure we can all agree on how important that is, how as a society, and as individuals, and as churches, we need to work much harder at being less angry and more civil with each other in the face of our deep disagreements and our competing claims. Well, that broad story plays out very differently in many different settings. And in this talk, I want to focus on just one of those settings, the political arena. I'll talk about the politics of deep diversity, how governments and other public bodies and political institutions can deal with the many kinds of difference that we face today, and equally why maintaining robust democratic structures and a democratic ethos is essential to that task of dealing with diversity. My talk has three parts. First, I'm going to briefly sketch why striving towards a politics of deep diversity is becoming so difficult and how people are responding to it. Second, I'll suggest a Christian rationale for why we should try. And third, I want to point to a Christian rationale for democracy as the only arena in which a politics of diversity can be achieved, and for democracy as a commitment that can't be traded in for some higher goal, however laudable, however seemingly Christian. And I'm going to conclude, because I have a reckless streak, by suggesting that these two commitments should inform how you vote in 3 weeks' time. Now that may sound presumptuous or audacious for a foreign visitor parachuting in and leaving very shortly. But even more recklessly, I'm going to hang around on campus for a whole other day. But let me say, in partial defense of this recklessness, I do have a personal stake in this. I have a wonderful daughter-in-law from Portland, Oregon, and I have a 6-year-old grandson with an American passport. So it is kind of personal. So first, why has a politics of deep diversity become so difficult? In 3 weeks' time, all of you who are eligible to vote will, I assume, have cast your votes. In fact, some of you will already have done so. And I'm just going to assume that it's a Christian imperative to vote, even when the available options seem, shall we say, unappetizing. In this election, the question of how to respond to diversity is probably more divisive and toxic than it has been for decades. Surrounding the choices you will make, all the way down the ballot, are acrimonious debates over how governments and other public bodies should deal with multiple kinds of difference. Race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, wealth and income, education, age, region, national origin, and legal status for migrants and refugees, political ideology, and of course religious belief. Now, of course, it's true that differences like these have shown up in many elections ever since the founding of the American Republic, indeed even before it. Living with deep diversity is hardly a new challenge for a nation of immigrants, many of whom fled European persecution, oppression, or poverty, as it was for the indigenous peoples inhabiting the land to which those immigrants came. As a nation, America is officially committed to protecting diversity and pluralism, even though, like many other democracies, including mine, it has often failed spectacularly to live up to that commitment, not least, of course, to those very indigenous peoples coercively displaced by the first European immigrants and to the Africans brought here by slavery. Finding ways to respond to diversities like these is always and everywhere a political challenge, part of the stuff of politics. And, you don't need me to tell you this, it's often handled very badly by governments, whose instincts are generally to ignore differences or to flatten them so that they're easier to manage. Treating differences in just and sustainable ways is very hard. But today, to growing numbers of citizens, the obstacles to finding just accommodations of deep diversity seem not simply more difficult, but insurmountable. People no longer believe that we can find ways to live with difference. And that's a momentous challenge for any nation, but especially America, because it means that an aspiration at the heart of America's vision of itself to welcome and protect diversity seems to be crumbling before our eyes. But similar challenges are present across much of Europe and elsewhere. How to respond justly to deep diversity is a growing global challenge. And it seems to me that as an outside observer, you may want to come back up to me on this loss of faith in America's capacity to treat deep diversity justly is leading to 3 dangerous temptations. One is a retreat into cynicism and a withdrawal from civic life into either a forgetful private consumerism or a resentful nursing of grievance. Well, of course, there are other factors breeding that kind of cynicism, but the difficulties of accommodating diversity is a major one. And those falling for this temptation are increasingly detached from civic life, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation by those who have more activist agendas. Let's call them the cynics. A second temptation is for those who think they've been running the show, who see themselves as leading the charge towards greater social progress, to double down on that power in order to keep the so-called deplorables well away from it. That's the word, you may remember, that Hillary Clinton used in 2015 to describe a certain class of supporters of Donald Trump. Insofar as they enjoy such power, they want to cling on to it. To call this second group the gatekeepers. A third temptation is to lurch into an aggressive militancy that wants to wrench back control of government from those seen as having illegitimately stolen it from the people, the true people, that is. This group has open contempt for democracy, and the activists leading them have advanced plans to circumvent it if necessary. Call this group the insurgents, and I'll come back to that a bit later. And we have all three groups in the UK. They're a little louder here, but that's just cultural. Every position on that spectrum undermines the structures and ethos of democracy, which is the only arena in which these differences can be peacefully negotiated. None of these positions offer solutions for how deep diversity can be justly treated. Rather, they either walk away from the problem or lapse into one or other form of exclusive tribalism, where we look after our own, looking to protect their own identity groups, which is the very opposite of the just accommodation of diversity. And I want to suggest that none of these options is available to faithful Christian citizens, whose calling is to throw themselves into the democratic arena in any way that they're able to, and to strive with others to find more just ways to live with all these diversities. From a Christian point of view, I want to suggest a just accommodation of diversity must be inclusive, expansive, hospitable, if not boundless. It seeks to be attentive to and respectful of every lawful voice, ready to count each speaker, each claimant as fully part of the political community, however much we may reject or deplore their actual views. Why should Christians do this? So my second section, a Christian case for a just politics of deep diversity. And remember, I'm speaking about the arena of politics, government, law, public policy, and so forth. How we might live with diversity in many other settings, families, churches, neighbourhoods, colleges, would require somewhat different answers. And let me run with that idea. A church, for example, may legitimately adopt a doctrinal standpoint that excludes some people from joining it. If you're one of the excluded, you'll hate that. You may deplore it. But you can't appeal to government to help you out. Churches aren't obliged to live with doctrinal diversity, although they may choose to. But governments don't or shouldn't have authority to adjudicate that kind of deep disagreement. Now that is actually just one example of a much larger achievement of modern American politics. A commitment to religious freedom and to government religious neutrality, key area of diversity. And this took constitutional form, as you all know, in the free exercise and establishment clauses of the First Amendment. Professor John Whitty, an American Christian legal historian, sums them up helpfully like this. The free exercise clause outlaws government proscriptions of religion, governmental actions that unduly burden the conscience, unduly restrict religious action and expression, intentionally discriminate against religion or invade the autonomy of churches and other religious bodies. The Establishment Clause outlaws government prescriptions of religion, actions that coerce the conscience, unduly mandate forms of religious action and expression, intentionally discriminate in favour of religion, or improperly ally the state with churches or other religious bodies. So this is how Americans have dealt with religious and conscientious diversity. Impressively so, in my view. Lawyers, of course, are continually debating the exact meanings of these clauses, and courts are routinely ruling on them, wisely or otherwise. John Whitty actually argues that religious freedom and government neutrality are in healthier shape today than they were even 10, 15 years ago. But I want to stress here that the First Amendment reflects a much broader vision. This is originally theological. This vision emerged especially in the work of the dissenting Protestants of the 17th century in England and in America, such as one of my favourites, the Puritan Roger Williams, who lambasted the oppressive and illiberal religious establishments of England and other European Christian states, and developed the first full-fledged defence of universal religious freedom and a neutral state. Indeed, I was struck to discover some time ago that uniquely, I think uniquely, among the early Puritans, as Governor of Rhode Island, Roger Williams formally granted religious freedom not only to rival Protestant groups, but also to Native Americans, to those who we would subsequently have called pagans. And he did so on biblical grounds. Now, cutting a very long and complex story very short, it was from sources like this that modernity's commitments to religious freedom and government neutrality eventually emerged. Of course, these commitments were also powerfully promoted by secular streams of thought, but they first emerged from the struggle of theologically orthodox religious minorities for religious freedom against governments that wanted to crush religious diversity. And these commitments of dissenting Protestants were, I believe, deeply rooted in the theology of the New Testament. And let me unpack a little bit of that theology. So under the confessional polity of biblical Israel, government was obliged by God to require religious conformity. Israel was created through a divine covenant under which all Israelites were bound to abide by the one religion of Yahweh. Foreign religions were prescribed. Indeed, foreign wives were prescribed. But under the new covenant, inaugurated in Jesus, this arrangement has gone forever. In the new covenant, the composition of the people of God, the covenant people, has changed irrevocably. As Paul writes to the Galatians, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but all are one in Jesus Christ. And this means that the people of God could never again be a territorial nation under a confessional government. It's now reconstituted as a transnational, multi-ethnic, multiracial, voluntary fellowship of believers, called to live in and witness to every nation. Accordingly, the church must place its identity in Christ, its loyalty to Christ, and its solidarity with Christ followers decisively above its limited loyalty to any nation, even its own nation. This means there are no longer any chosen nations, no theologically exceptional nations, no nations with special providential assignments from God, as my nation thought it had in the 19th century, when it controlled an exploitative empire that covered nearly a third of the globe. To me, this means that we must reject from the start the idea of an officially Christian nation or a confessionally Christian government. Christian citizens may not look to government to impose, endorse, privilege, advantage, or prescribe any religious creed. That power is denied to government by the core theology of the New Testament, I would suggest. Now, over time, of course, as a result of the missionary work of the church, a nation may come to contain a substantial minority or a majority of Christians. And if they live faithfully in every area of life, that nation may gradually be infused with a Christian ethos and begin to live according to the Christian principles. And those principles may also, in turn, come to be reflected in the nature of its government, even when Christians don't control the government. And that has indeed occurred, of course, historically, even if always very imperfectly. So, for example, many historians have pointed out that it's no accident that democracies, for all their faults, originally emerged in Christian, indeed Protestant, nations. And you can say it's legitimate and perhaps sometimes even necessary for Christians to remind their fellow citizens that if their nation loses its Christian foundations, it will have to work hard to find some other nurturing soil in which democracy can be sustained. Because democratic institutions are not self-sustaining. But granting that, there is nevertheless a fundamental difference between gladly acknowledging the religious sources of a nation's political culture and requiring government to officially endorse those sources. If our fellow citizens no longer affirm our nation's Christian sources, repairing that is a task for the church, not for the government. Governments who try to do that always do it very badly. So if Christians think they're oppressed by a secularist government, the solution is not to work for an officially Christian government, because that would be just to replace one confessional monopoly with another. The faithful response is to get back to that work of infusing the nation gradually with a Christian political ethos and principles, and to do that much more by enacting these principles in practice than by preaching them to skeptics. And that is a patient work of generations, not of one or two election cycles. So certainly Christians should work against imposed secularism. But they should reject the language of restoring America as a Christian nation. Equally, they should affirm that Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and adherents to many varieties of secularism are fully equal citizens of the US, the UK, with identical rights to contribute to the shaping of the political community. All should enjoy robust freedom of conscience, and none should seek a monopoly over government or society. So Christians should thus favour what many commentators have called civic pluralism, some have called covenantal pluralism. And this is not a mere reluctant, pragmatic concession to the fact of our minority status as Christians, to be withdrawn once we gain power again. Rather, it's a principled response to deep diversity. Hence, another term used to name this position is principled pluralism. And again, this is not to celebrate the existence of worldviews other than Christianity, although we can learn a great deal from many of them. It is simply to deal justly with our fellow citizens' deep but diverse convictions, as we expect them to deal justly with ours. So that's just one area of deep diversity, religious and conscientious diversity. But Christians have good reasons to be committed not only to that kind of diversity, but to several other kinds of diversity. And again, the guiding principle here is one of equality of respect. So I mentioned Paul's injunction in Galatians that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. And then there are many other injunctions in the Bible that extend the call of respect to other areas of diversity. Indeed, even in the Old Testament, the people of God were commanded to welcome sojourners, that is, foreigners. And because of these injunctions, which were then radicalized by the gospel, from its beginning, the church could never accept national, ethnic, or racial inequality in its midst. the doors of the church were thrown open to all comers, whatever their differences. And the church also practiced from the beginning a surprising degree, not a complete degree, but a surprising degree of gender equality in what was a powerfully patriarchal culture. It also refused to allow economic differences to divide its congregations, urging the rich to support and respect the poor. It's often struck me that the very words of institution that churches everywhere use at the communion service, these are words taken from 1 Corinthians 11, follow a strong censure by Paul of richer Christians who are showing contempt in worship gatherings for their poorer believers who couldn't afford to buy food. Jesus gave his body and blood for you, and you can't even share a meal with a fellow believer, is what he was saying. Cutting another long and complex story very short, over time, that radical theology of equal respect for diversity could not but spill outside the church. In many different settings, this theology inspired faithful Christians to work towards religious, racial, ethnic, gender, economic, and other forms of equality among all their fellow citizens, not just fellow believers. They came to see that if the gospel we receive in Christ restores us to our full humanity, then that same gospel must speak to all humanity. And that should be integral to the church's witness. So the church could not simply cultivate equal respect for diversity behind closed doors. The gospel also applied socially, economically, and politically, and in time made demands on governments. And in time, a very long time I hasten to add, it also inspired an explicit commitment to democracy, to opening the task of government to the contribution of all the people in all their diversity. In Christian terms, I suggest, the heart of democracy is not a doctrine of popular sovereignty, the assertion of the primacy of the will of the people, nor is a democracy a means merely to get my interests or my tribe's interests satisfied. Rather, for all its faults, which are many, and in the next 3 weeks we'll see them displayed in a multicoloured figure. Lost my thread. Rather, democracy is a vocation to political service. It's the idea that every citizen is called to promote the common good by engaging in the search for a just public order for all, in all their diversities, through voting and in many other ways. And today Christians everywhere need to retrieve this gospel of equality of respect for diversity and allow it to shape their political thinking and acting and voting. Now, of course, Christians often today everywhere disagree deeply about what kinds of diversity are actually worthy of respect, which ones are the most important, and what government should do about them, if anything. There's no shortcut to overcoming that kind of Christian disagreement. But in the third and final section, I do want to say something. I want to make a strong claim about one pressing matter on which I suggest there should indeed be Christian unity. So that's my third section, a Christian case for the priority of constitutional democracy. So I've said that there are powerful biblical grounds for striving for a just politics of diversity, seeking an equal and inclusive political arena in which all lawful voices find a place, are listened to, and are treated in law and public policy with due respect, even as we work hard to negotiate our disagreements about what those very differences imply for law and policy. But not all manifestations of diversity can or should be respected by government, or by us. Even in the most tolerant society, there are always limits to the public expression of pluralism. For example, the state may have given legal respect to same-sex marriages, but it has not done so for forced marriages, or, yet, to polygamous marriages. Pluralism is not a libertarian free-for-all. It has to be framed within parameters that limit what is permissible for the sake of the larger public good and for the sake of the rights of the vulnerable. Respect for diversity is only one of the duties of government. There are many others, including respect for individual or institutional rights, maintaining public order, or sustaining an infrastructure of public services on which everyone depends. And sometimes these other duties of government collide with the duty of respecting diversity. And those collisions require very careful negotiation over time. But there's another fundamental limit to diversity. The state cannot tolerate the actions of those intending to subvert the forum of democracy itself. Because without that forum, there will be no arena in which diversities can be negotiated. No secure protection for any forms of difference or freedom, religious or otherwise. Protecting diversity depends on vigilantly guarding a strong democracy. Now, so far in my talk, I've just used the single word democracy, and I want to complicate that a bit. To clarify what I mean by speaking instead of constitutional democracy. Now, I could have used the familiar term liberal democracy, the one which most of us use most of the time, and which for most purposes would be fine, but I happen to think that the term constitutional democracy better captures the heart of a Christian perspective. That's my judgment. A constitutional democracy is one that seeks to channel the voice of the people through the guardrails of law and justice. So it's a system in which gives capacious space for the legitimate voice of the people, but constrains that voice by laws and structures that attempt to steer both the people and the government somewhat closer towards the ways of justice. Never guarantees justice, but it does mitigate against gross injustice better than pretty much any other political system now available to us. I've already mentioned how a biblical gospel of equal respect for diversity helped power later movements for democracy. It's a big story to tell there. We don't have time to tell it now. I said that democracy is essentially a vocation to political service. It took a long time for most of the church to reach that conclusion, admittedly, but very few serious Christian thinkers would now reject it. But before the church, long before the church embraced democracy, it had already embraced constitutionalism. The idea that government doesn't only make the law, but is also under the law. And there's a very long and rich tradition of Christian-inspired constitutionalism going back to the Middle Ages, reflecting biblical and traditional teachings on ideas like natural law, justice, authority, the limits of authority, participation, the common good, and many others. And this rich tradition played a key role in laying foundations for our modern constitutional orders, notably in the US. A just and effective constitution both empowers governments to do justice, but also hems them in whatever they're doing. And it does so by requiring them to act according to law, by holding them accountable to the properly elected representatives of the people, by distributing authority across many different centres, by decentralising power, such as in federalism, by upholding the rights of individuals that check state power, by ensuring transparent and impartial electoral processes and peaceful transfers of power to new governments. That's just a selection of the components of constitutionalism. And this legacy of Christian constitutionalism is as great an achievement as is a Christian-inspired commitment to democracy. And together they bequeath a great gift to modern Western politics. Now, obviously, every constitutional government is deeply flawed. None lives up to these principles fully, and many are deeply subverted by self-interest, corporate lobbying, incompetence, foreign influence, or the sheer folly and ignorance of the people, which is us. So we shouldn't idealise constitutional democracy. But I do submit that the findings of the Christian political tradition today and centuries of historical experience do suggest that the jury is now in on some form of constitutional democracy as decisively the best regime. So that Christians shouldn't simply say today, I support democracy, but the Christian tradition allows you to support whatever regime that you prefer. I don't think that's available to us today. Now, this is obviously not any kind of straight derivation from the Bible, but then many of our most important contemporary Christian judgments about how we should live are not either. But today we find ourselves in a unique situation in which one writer, American Christian ethicist David Gushee, writes a book called Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. Whether we call these enemies Christian nationalists, Christian authoritarians, or Christian populists, the basic worry is that they, at best, sit loose to the norms of constitutional democracy. Some are openly contemptuous of it. For them, a commitment to constitutional democracy has become conditional, at best. It's not the best regime in all circumstances, in all weathers. I heard a lengthy podcast last week in which two fluent, theologically orthodox American Christian leaders, they would call themselves evangelical, not only defended the idea of an officially Christian nation, which I hasten to add is not in itself an undemocratic thing to do, that's a legitimate political opinion, but argued that American democracy is now so corrupted by progressive elites that it was... That's one of the progressive elites telling you to... Shut up. Sorry. It tells me I've got 5 minutes left. So better get going. This was one of my climaxes. Now it's all dissolved. Where was I? Yes. So not only did he defend the idea of a Christian nation, but argued that American democracy is now so corrupted by those progressive elites that were listening in, that it was time for a Caesar-like figure to emerge, temporarily bypassing democracy in order to rescue America and impose Christian order on it. Now, by a Caesar-like figure, I imagine they have in mind not Donald Trump, but some more competent authoritarian. One of the podcasters, a certain Kevin Roberts, is he known to anybody here? No, there's so many of these podcasters out there cultivating small audiences, but warns against complacently tolerating diversity in the present moment because it leads to all sorts of corruptions. He said, quote, "It's fine to take a laissez approach to diversity when you are in the safety of the sunshine, but when the twilight descends and you hear the wolves, you've got to circle the wagons and load the muskets." Apparently he's about to come out with a book. I've forgotten the actual main title of the book, but an early subtitle of this book was "Burning Down America to Save America," which happily the publisher declined to agree with. Okay, now these may be extreme voices, but what worries me more than these extreme voices is that there seems to me, a much broader group of Christians, mostly self-described evangelicals, who are no longer fully committed to respecting the norms of constitutional democracy in all circumstances. And polls also suggest, you may have seen them, that a disturbingly large minority of American Christians today do not entirely reject the use of political violence. Well, if we want to protect both diversity and democracy, it's essential that we powerfully resist this kind of talk and the actions it might legitimate, or rather has already legitimated. For against this podcaster, it's precisely when the twilight descends and you hear the wolves that we must redouble our commitment to the norms of constitutional democracy and openly oppose any attempt to subvert it. That is why the violent mob that stormed the Capitol on January the 6th, 2021, had to be prosecuted. The assault disrupted a lawful joint session of Congress convened to certify the results of the election of 2020, which President Trump had lost, as confirmed in numerous subsequent court cases. In my view, he too should be held personally legally accountable for his palpable incitement of such an unconstitutional attack on the very foundations of American democracy. It's not enough simply to avoid endorsing these subversive ideas emerging from Christians who reject constitutional order. Remaining silent when its foundations are under threat is not being neutral, it's not being non-partisan, it's not respecting both sides. It is being unwittingly complicit in the subversion of constitutional democracy. Every attempt to treat diversity justly is at stake if constitutional democracy itself is subverted. Caesar-like figures are not kind to diversity. So Christians should go public, loudly, in their defence of constitutional democracy, even at the risk of increasing Christian disunity. Well, I think you know where this is going. For what it's worth, here I am, British visitor, here today, gone on Thursday. The prospect of a second Trump presidency is now such a clear and present danger to American constitutional democracy that it seems to me that keeping him out of office must be the overriding consideration in deciding how to vote on November the 4th. His incitement of a violent assault on the Capitol on January the 6th should be sufficient in itself to disqualify him from any public office. But he showed contempt for constitutional democratic norms in numerous other ways, before, during, and since taking office, and repeatedly states his intention of doing so again. And he has shown consistent contempt for respecting many of the kinds of diversity I discussed earlier. Now, the alternatives may not, as I hinted at the start, be very appealing to many of you. But in my judgment, none of them pose an imminent threat to the very foundations of democratic order itself. So, to conclude, that's the judgment of one foreign observer trying to interpret these events carefully and who also has a personal stake in the outcome. Whatever you make of that judgment, and however you vote, I'll certainly be joining you in prayer on November the 4th that the prospect of just constitutional democracy in America be protected, that governments of any stripe and at any level learn to do their necessary part in helping all Americans to respect and live justly with deep diversity of many kinds. And, perhaps most importantly, that the Church may faithfully witness to and practically enact a radical commitment to equal respect that makes the gospel of Jesus Christ more credible in an age that desperately needs to hear it. Thank you very much for your patience.
We got some time for questions or comments or anything else. I'll let Dr. Chaplin sort of field those.
So you speak about deep diversity, and that would suggest there's shallow diversity.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can define what deep diversity means and what the other type of diversity is.
Yeah. So traditionally, in this kind of discourse, deep diversity has referred to religious diversity or philosophical moral diversity, differences of fundamental conviction. But one of the things I think I'm trying to say is that lots of other things that have traditionally been seen as shallow are now becoming deep, because people are much, much more invested in them than they were in the past, for all sorts of reasons. Some are perfectly healthy reasons, some are problematic reasons. So the line divide between what used to be called deep diversity and shallow diversity is getting blurred, I think. And that makes the whole landscape just much more complicated and difficult. And now, of course, how this seems to us depends on our own location, our own diversities. So for African Americans, race has been a deep diversity right from the beginning. You know, they don't need any lessons in deep diversity and how it impacts adversely on them. You know, women aren't a minority, but discrimination against women has been endemic and is still pretty pervasive. So they don't need to take lessons in diversity. You know, they've been at the rough end of it. So it depends on your experience of it. Depends on who you are and what identity traits you feel you possess and you invest in, or are being, your experience is being suppressed in some way or the other. So it's a complex territory, which is a bit of a cop-out of an answer. But
Thank you.
yeah.
Several times you use the term negotiate and talking about how people who are different in a democracy work out being together in a democracy. And I'm just curious about some examples of where you would see that kind of negotiating happening. In what context in a democracy? I mean, I think I know, but it'd be interesting to hear you flesh it out.
Yeah, there is one particular example that I think is quite useful. I looked it up before I came. There's a group called the Centre for Public Justice, which is based in Washington, D.C. A Christian organisation that's been working on these issues for decades. And some years back, they struck up a conversation with LGBTQI campaigners, because it was quite clear to everybody that here was two clashing diversities that just seemed to be irreconcilable. The rights of religious conscience versus the rights of sexual identity, equalities and so forth, hitting institutions of all kinds, particularly Christian institutions, religious institutions, maybe this one, I don't know. And so they sat down with them, and over a period of time, you know, just had very frank, extended, long conversations, put each other's position papers back and forth, and eventually struck up an agreement, an agreed position. It didn't satisfy either of them 100%, but it was one that they could commit to jointly. I forgot, there's a document that came out on this, I don't know if you remember it, anybody, some years back, about 5 years ago, or something like that, which is a joint campaigning document to use, both sides could use in lobbying public bodies at any level, you know, local governments, state governments, and so forth. So that will be one example where you take the time, you know, to try and forge a workable agreement between two positions that started out seeming intractable. That's a sort of specific example, but that would be the kind of thing. That's done at the citizen level. When it comes to legislation and policy, of course, it has to be done at the institutional level. So that has to be enacted in legislatures, you know, in municipal councils, in all sorts of public bodies. But it's a sort of a micro example, I think, of how deep diversity can be successfully negotiated. I'm sure many of you have other examples of that. Yeah.
I very much appreciate your comments this evening. I just can't help thinking again and again while you were speaking, the church is the answer, but the church is certainly the problem. And it has been throughout American history.